ainda, não? A longer delay than normal, Kevin. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, now we can start. Felipe will introduce you, then I'll just say a few words, and then he'll talk about your CV, your accomplishments, and then we'll hand it over to you. Okay?
Great. Obrigado.
Obrigado, professor Ralph, né? Obrigado a todos por estarem aqui hoje. Boa tarde, sejam bem-vindos, né? Vamos iniciar agora o último dia, né, do 4º Congresso da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia e Educação. Eu vou passar, então, rapidamente a palavra ao professor Ralph Bannon, né? O professor Ralph, ele é professor associado ao Departamento de Educação da PUC-Rio. Ele possui mestrado e doutorado em pensamento social e política pela Universidade de Sussex, na Inglaterra. Ele vai abrir aqui um pouquinho e depois nós vamos passar para o professor Kevin Williams, da Dublin City University. Professor Ralph, a palavra é sua.
Okay, thank you very much. But there'll be no translation in this room, simultaneous translation. But there is a translation for those who want it in another room. Okay. Well, Kevin, thank you very much for your time and your availability to be with us. This is the 4th conference of the Brazilian Society of the Philosophy of Education. We have them every 2 years. Although obviously 2 years ago we didn't have one because of the pandemic. That's why we're having it now. We always invite renowned speakers from all around the world. This year we've invited a number as well, including yourself. So welcome. We are affiliated with lots of other societies in the world. And also have links with the British Philosophy Education Society. So I'll now pass over to Felipe because he'll tell everybody, he'll tell everybody who you are, where you're from, what you've done, and then we'll start the lecture. Okay?
Obrigado, Sr. Ralph. Eu vou apresentar ele aqui em português para algumas pessoas, depois eu posso fazer a apresentação em inglês, se todos acharem adequado. O professor Kevin Williams, né, ele é um Senior Research Fellow no Centro para Avaliação, Qualidade e Inspeção do Estudo de Educação da Dublin University. Ele já foi presidente da Associação de Estudos Educacionais da Irlanda. Entre as obras dele, a gente pode citar Religion, Culture, School in Ireland, de 2005. Education and the Voice of Michael Oakeshott, de 2007, pela Imprint Academic, e Religion and Citizenship Education in Europe. Esse último, inclusive, ele foi escrito como parte do projeto Children's Identity and Citizenship Education in Europe, financiado pela Comissão Europeia. Tá? Vou introduzir em inglês, e aí eu passo a palavra para ele. Dr. Kevin Williams is Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Evaluation, Quality and Inspection, Institute of Education of the Dublin University. Former president of the Educational Studies Association of Ireland, his books include Faith in Ireland, Education in the Voice of Michael Oakeshott, and Religion and Citizenship Education in Europe of 2008, written as part of the Children's Identity and Citizenship Education in Europe project funded by the European Commission. Kevin, it's an honor to have you here. We're very pleased to have you here and have the opportunity to hear from you. So now it's your show.
Right. Obrigado, Felipe. Bem-vindos a todos. Desculpe, não posso falar em português, embora amo o idioma. Também amo o futebol brasileiro. Cresci admirando o time, mas lembro bem da agonia do mineral. Que desastre. Então, infelizmente, tenho que falar em inglês, uma língua que para mim é legado de colonialismo. So I changed to that now. Now, this paper deals, of course, with the work of Michael Oakeshott, but it's not exclusively concerned with the work of Michael Oakeshott. So some of you who may feel, well, I don't care about Michael Oakeshott, perfectly understandable attitude. I don't think I'll get anything from this. I hope people will, and possibly also students, graduate and postgraduate students, because this paper is actually a learning of mine. I learned something from the book I wrote on Michael Oakeshott, from a very, very subtle criticism. And it taught me an important lesson, that there's no perfection in what we write, and there's always a possibility of improvement. And the long essay, which criticizes my work on Oakeshott, taught me a lot. Infelizmente, it was 8 years after I wrote the book. So anyway, the talk considers a problem in Oakeshott's theory of civic society. Its impotence to support the robust forms of education that is one of the underlying postulates of the theory. There is a significant disconnect between Oakeshott's political philosophy on human conduct and his philosophy of education. I've noticed this before in other aspects of Oakeshott's work. Sometimes he writes without consideration of other works he has written on different topics, and they're not necessarily consistent. Anyway, I consider the plausibility of a critique of a crucial feature of Oakeshott's oeuvre. In a long essay in political theory, Andrew Norris astutely identifies a disconnect between Oakeshott's political philosophy, particularly in human conduct, and his theory of education in the many essays he has devoted to the subject. So part of his critique takes issue with my claim in the book on Oakeshott, and his essay led me to reconsider whether Oakeshott's forms of civil association permits state intervention in support of the poor. Norris claims that I and other commentators, I'm not the only guilty one then, espouse too flexible and generous a view of what Oakeshott's theory allows. Anyway, let me say something about Oakeshott's political philosophy in general. It is constructed on an account of civil life which aims to accommodate the maximized exercise of human freedom. It is based on a conception of the state, which is in turn based on a theory about forms of human association. He argues that human beings can be joined together in two forms of association, one of which he calls enterprise association and the other civil association. Now, enterprise association he sometimes calls purposive association. That is association with a purpose. And an enterprise association is made up of individuals joined together in terms of the pursuit of a common purpose, some condition of things to be jointly procured, or some common interest to be continuously satisfied. On the other hand, civil association refers to a relationship in terms of a practice rather than in terms of a purpose. It refers to a form of relationship where people are joined together, not in the pursuit of a joint purpose or purposes, but in terms of the recognition of the authority of rules of the social practice that is constituted by the rule of law. This he calls the practice of civility or of civil life. Other practices we may be familiar with include games and the languages we speak. So, the problem then is, in a form of civil association, what sort of mechanism can exist to ensure taxation and income distribution? Now, a system of taxation is the principal mechanism for the redistribution of resources. The taxation code is a system of rules that can be altered through an activity of politics expressed through appropriate discussion and debate. In my book, I argue that this is far from the politics of enterprise association, involving the identification of a corporate purpose and of deciding how benefits might be appropriately redistributed to this end. On the contrary, my argument was that taxation represents the politics of civil association because it involves considering the desirability of laws or rules with a view to their conservation or alteration. Engaging in this form of politics demands acknowledgement of the authority of the law embodied in the taxation code, and consequently an acceptance of the procedures whereby its provisions are enacted, amended, and repealed. I argue that it doesn't turn civil association into enterprise association. Then I noticed something else in Oakeshott's work in defense of my position, and it occurs in a footnote where he refers to the inner morality of his ideal of a civil association. This can be understood to permit the substantial shift in resources necessary to facilitate a more extensive access by the poor to education. There is no reason in principle why this inner morality should not accommodate a distribution of resources that would put participation in education within the reach of everyone, in practice as well as in theory. Now, in retrospect, I think I certainly put far too much weight on a comment Oakeshott makes in a footnote. I said, that was a misguided judgment on my part. But Norris takes a more extensive issue with my claims, and he sharply and comprehensively criticizes my argument that Oakeshott's theory of civil life and the form of civil association is consistent with a distributivist purpose, that is, a purpose of distributing wealth and resources. He challenges this reading of Oakeshott's theory of civil association, made by me and others, arguing that it is not hospitable to the attribution to the state of a role in intervening to improve the conditions for teaching and learning of children in schools in poor areas, because this may involve a substantial transfer of financial resources via the levying of taxes. The attempt to improve significantly these schools, argues Norris, will require the non-voluntary appropriation of income from taxpayers who have no say in the matter. Now, Norris is probably not quite right to say they have no say in the matter, because after all, taxation is a matter for political and civic debate. But Norris believes that for individual liberty to flourish within Oakeshott's theory of civil life, the domestic activity of the state must be radically curtailed. It must refrain from the pursuit of a supposed common good. And I think there's much truth in what Norris says. And then he goes on to say that participation in civil association does require an appropriate education. It is not an independent, self-sustaining mode of association. And Oakeshott's account of the postulates of this form of life entails a robust form of education. Why? because this form of education is necessary to enable young people to come to understand, to value, and preserve civilization. And what is most important, and this is a theme I'll be taking up, to allow all citizens to develop their individuality. In retrospect, I wish to accept much of Norris's claim that I exaggerate the hospitality of the theory of civil association to the redistribution of resources. In retrospect now, and when I read his essay about 4 or 5 years ago, I should have offered a different kind of argument. And this argument is based on a flaw in Oakeshott's thinking, diagnosed well over 40 years ago by Josiah Lee Auspich in the same journal in which Oakeshott's article appears. And this is Oakeshott's tendency insufficiently to multiply essences and to work in terms of a very conceptual repertoire. He takes Occam's razor too far. Occam says entities should not be multiplied, but there's a limit to which we can reduce them. By Oakeshott's conceptual apparatus leads them to make dichotomies that are unacceptably stark. A notable characteristic of his conceptual mapping is to divide experience in an oppositional way, in an oppositional or either or way, into one or two categories. For example, and I have written extensively about this, he makes a distinction between the worlds of art and aesthetic experience and the world of practical life, which is not sustainable. In fact, reflecting on this, it's like he's claiming that in South America, there are only 2 languages spoken, Portuguese and Spanish. But of course, we know that's not true. There are multiple indigenous languages, and in fact, 3 national languages, French, Dutch, and English. I said, yes, that does capture the difficulty in Oakeshott's conceptual repertoire. So the contrast drawn between the 2 forms of association, civil, which he refers to as societas, and enterprise, which he refers to as universitas, is too sharp and unequivocal. And Norris puts this very well, and I salute him. And I said, I wish I'd said this in the book. In respect of this aspect of Oakeshott's work, I do say it in respect of other aspects. In the end, Norris argues, civil association is entangled with enterprise association, not merely for accidental or non-essential reasons, but because it requires conditions it cannot itself provide. Norris is correct in his claim that a postulate of a robust education that promotes individuality requires the state to manage and redistribute resources in providing a universal education, and in this way to act as an enterprise association. So the 2 forms of association are entangled. Oakeshott endeavors to make the distinction far too stark. So, what does he say about individuality? Because at the heart of his theory of education is a wish to promote the individuality of citizens. He subscribes passionately to the idea of individuality, and he offers an illuminating account of the historical emergence of this ideal of individuality and its counterpart notion, that of the anti-individual or the individual monkey, the limited individual. Individuality incorporates the notion of personal autonomy, but the concept is far richer and more resonant. It takes us beyond mere autonomy. In developing his notion of individuality, Oakeshott turns to an examination of the history of the moral life. He identifies three forms of moral conduct: the morality of communal ties, the morality of individuality, and the morality of the common good. Each form of the moral life has a corresponding understanding of the appropriate office and task of the activities of government. And these different forms represent dominant tendencies in the evolution of European moral consciousness, although he admits that he has somewhat artificially extrapolated them from history. Communal morality identified good conduct with appropriate observance of one's role and duties in the life of the community. Moral expectations were subscribed and circumscribed by the individual's position in the feudal social hierarchy. Conditions of medieval life made the expression and assertion of individuality very difficult. And in fact, it could be risk being interpreted as treason or heresy. But, as we know from history, feudal conditions of social organization were gradually modified. And a new social order emerged in which the individual status as a lord or a vassal or a mere serf was no longer automatically assumed. And in conjunction with the evolution of this new social order, Oakeshott argues that there also emerged a new and different kind of understanding of human nature. It's a very large claim. This was expressed in terms of general culture in what we call the Renaissance, and it took a specifically religious form in the Reformation. It called into question the theological assumptions underlying the communal organization of the feudal social order. And an awareness of moral identity evolved in terms of individual personality. This awareness first took hold in Italy, where, in the memorable words of Jacob Burckhardt in the end of the 13th century, the country began to swarm with individuality. Powerful metaphor, swarm with individuality. Where the ban laid upon human personality was dissolved, and where 1,000 figures meet us, each in his own special shape and dress. Now, according to Oakeshott, people responded in two ways to the challenges posed by the demands of this new social order. Some welcomed the opportunity to create a personal moral identity for themselves, while others were satisfied to assume the attenuated moral identity of what he calls the individual monkey, that's the limited individual, the anti-individual, the mass man, or what I call individuals with a herd mentality. This kind of personality rejected the challenge to exercise moral autonomy that followed the dissolution of medieval social order. Freedom and its consequent responsibility were unwanted burdens which some individuals felt unable or unwilling to assume. They felt unhappy and insecure without the support of the feudal social order, which prescribed their social and moral duties. I often thought when I was reading this that that's what happens to individuals who've been incarcerated in prison for a long time. And among the dominant personal qualities of this kind of character were, and still are, pusillanimity, lack of confidence, and envy and resentment at those who derive satisfaction from the exercise of their freedom. According to Oakeshott, what this character sought was a morality which would at once assuage her insecurity and curtail or prescribe the activities of the person who found happiness in a private sphere of action. Though it was not possible to constitute the feudal order, the anti-individual sought a form of morality which would reflect as far as possible the medieval morality of communal ties. The outcome of this was what Oakeshott called, perhaps most notably, a morality of the common good. A contrary conception of human nature and of morality is expressed in the character of individuals who embody Oakeshott's positive moral ideal. These individuals responded to the moral challenge which followed the dissolution of the medieval social order by forging for themselves a moral law, an auto nomos. Auto is self, nomos is law in Greek. Namely, a self-made law, making of each individual a law unto himself. Associated with the character of autonomous individuals was a profound self-understanding, together with a confident command of resources. But the moral character of this person is very different from that of moral eccentrics, who, in their idiosyncrasy, may also be considered a law unto themselves. Of course, reflecting on this distinction, I think we encounter again an example of Oakeshott's dichotomizing tendency, dividing everything into two. But I want to leave aside the plausibility of his bifurcation of moral types. But it seems to me far too stark. But his conception of individuality needs extensive elaboration. And that's what I propose to move on to now, to consider what individuality means and how the state fits in to promoting individuality through education. Now, reading Oakeshott, one gets a sense of individuality as primarily a moral attitude. But it also includes, in my view, a command of resources to make some positive and creative use of our lives. Jane Austen refers to these resources as resources for solitude. And I think I would like to unpack Oakeshott's notion of personal resources in giving a richer and more elaborate account of individuality. It's not only individuality should not be envisaged only as a matter of making intellectual decisions, but it is also given expression in involvement in groups with which we identify. And reflecting on it, I was struck by the absence of any activity which really engages them, which is sometimes found among disaffected young people, and indeed among those who find themselves at a loose end following retirement. The kind of identification I refer to is a relationship between an individual and a chosen pursuit. And the presence of a connection between human beings and their activities is a defining feature of their individuality, not just their capacity to make moral choices. I think individuality finds expression in the enjoyment of what life offers for its own sake or on its own account, rather than for the sake of a profit, a reward, or a prize, in addition to the experience itself. And Oakeshott has written very eloquently about this notion of activities engaged in for their own sake. Aspects of this experience are to be found in any activity that we engage in for the pleasure of it. Typical of such activities are enjoying human relations, surfing, golfing, mountaineering, and all other activities that have certain purposes, ends, or outcomes written into them. But they are not amenable to a means-end logic. For example, the exhilaration, the sense of mastery, of well-being, of closeness to nature that a person can derive from surfing are not ends to which certain physical arrangements are the means. From the enthusiastic and practiced participant's point of view, such feelings are what surfing is for her. They are not ends instrumentally related to participation in the activity itself. I also think that we need to uncouple the notions of classical liberal learning and the cultivation of individuality. I think this is assumed by Michael Oakeshott and indeed by Andrew Norris. The development of individuality can be envisioned in forms that go beyond the purely academic or intellectual. Just like the learning required in classical liberal education, practical learning or craft work can also be understood in a manner compatible with the shaping of individuality. It is interesting that Oakeshott is actually uncomfortable with the Greek distinction between the arts of music, poetry, and drama, and arts like sculpture and painting that were at the time perceived as mere crafts, because they involved interaction with the material world. But these activities belong outside the everyday world, the world of getting and spending. And he claims that we have risen above the distinction between arts and crafts. And I think this points to the possibility of an expansive and generous conception of individuality that extends beyond what academic learning can provide, and affirms the potential of practical learning in human flourishing. What Oakeshott describes as learning to make something of ourselves, learning to make the most or best of ourselves, or I suppose what is captured in the German phrase Bildung, can also assume an embodied quality. This possibility is regrettably not foregrounded in Oakeshott's philosophy of education. And I loved reading about the experience of an Irishman called Mike Cooley, who was an environmentalist and engineer. He is perhaps around 70 now, but he grew up in rural Ireland over 50 years ago. And he tells us that he learned to think with and through his hands, and that skilled interactions between humans and their physical environment have a central role to play in the cultivation of individuality. It is a mistake, argues Cooley, to conceive a craft tradition as simply the transmission of manual dexterity, where it is actually the transmission of a great culture, of how to organize yourself, how to get materials, how to plan things. It involves a metaphorical conversation with the craft tradition involved. So, individuality and its cultivation occurs in contexts that extend beyond the forms of traditional liberal education espoused by Oakeshott and indeed by Norris. It is also possible, and this is the third point I'm moving on to overstate the need for the state to be involved in cultivating individuality through institutions of formal learning. There are limits to the extent to which it is realistic or appropriate for state intervention to redistribute the resources necessary for education. But state involvement in education can be necessary, as I will make clear. And one of the ways I came to this view was that in the discourse, particularly the popular discourse about education, certainly in Ireland, there's an emphasis on resources. We need resources. We need more money. And I think, yes, this is important, but this can imply a limiting vision of education. Yet, the state does have a role, certainly in providing for the poor, because access to educational institutions may require significant state involvement. And this is an intervention, is an expression of the interest of the community in ensuring maximum access to the intrinsic and positional advantages of education. The law of the market and the vagaries of philanthropy are highly unlikely ever to assure the full benefits of education to the population at large. The same, of course, applies in respect of healthcare. It is one thing to tolerate private schooling, but it's naive to think that private agencies, will assume responsibility for the education of the poor and of the hard to teach. Without public support, Oakeshott's model of liberal learning, as articulated through his work, is unlikely to become the legacy of every citizen in our societies. But there are limits to the necessity for state involvement in education, as shall be shown next. And in fact, if I delivered this paper in Ireland, people would consider me a right-winger for saying that there are limits to the necessity for state involvement. Why do I make this argument, which would not be popular anyway? In the first place, it is not as if education were not being supported by public funds. The possibilities for the rich cultivation of individuality are already to be found in many schools, and their presence in state schools should not be underestimated. It may well be true that in many countries, the condition of state-supported public schools compared to their fee-charging private equivalents makes the task of educating students in the public schools more difficult. And of course, this is comparative education tells us this in very, very many contexts, that the more difficult, least tractable students are very often found in state schools rather than in private schools, or indeed, sadly, I have to say, in Catholic schools. The quality of experience of school is not, however, confined to children in middle-class schools. Imaginative and committed teachers strive, even in the most unpromising of circumstances, to offer these possibilities to their students. Franco-American author Nancy Houston reflects with admiration on the work done by teachers of literature in disadvantaged areas of France, who, by managing to relate literature to real life, succeed in arousing in young people a passion for reading. High culture is not the prerogative of middle and upper classes, and indeed, this is something that Oakeshott feels very strongly. He wrote to me many years ago now, when I suggested some criticisms of his philosophy of education and his idea of the school. He said this: "No doubt my school is an ideal, but it is not the product of fancy. It really did and does still almost exist. Many years ago," he writes, "when he was in Dublin, his taxi driver turned around and quoted to him a line from Virgil." Now, this is not just aspirational rhetoric and wishful thinking. I think of the memoirs of many educators: Frank McCourt, Brian McMahon, John McGahern. They're all Irish writers, but I'm sure people will be able to give examples of writers from different countries. But their memoirs are replete with examples of teachers who managed to connect with the lives of young people in difficult circumstances. And my friend and colleague, Pádraig Hogan, provides compelling illustrations of the possibilities of exciting, learner-centered approaches to teaching in difficult teaching environments. Hogan applies his metaphor of cultural courtship to show how young people who are very negatively disposed towards classroom learning can be reached. And I give references to some of Pádraig's work in my own work. And it's very, very interesting, because unlike some theorists, Pádraig gives examples of how he himself, when he was a teacher, and other teachers managed to connect with the lives of young people who are disaffected and dislike school. In fact, there's a kind of something in the spirit of Paulo Freire in Pádraig Hogan's writing, and it's marvelously well rooted in concrete examples. not just high theories. Another thing that strikes me, again, people would say, hey, this is a bit of a very conservative view, but I wonder if the appropriateness of state involvement in sponsoring classical forms of liberal education is what parents and students always want. Now, I know, perhaps even notoriously, there's a huge emphasis on traditional school learning and traditional school exams, but other people have other priorities. And some parents and students may want vocationally oriented schooling, as described by Frank McCourt in his wonderful book, memoir, Teacher Man. If there's one book I would recommend that you guys read, it's Frank McCourt's Teacher Man. It's about his experience teaching in different schools in New York, in tough schools, but also in privileged schools. And I should say, as an aside, we have to be careful not to exaggerate the difference between the experience of young people in disadvantaged poor schools and of pupils in well-off schools. One time, 2 or 3 years ago now, or more, as part of my job, I was supervising a student teacher in a school in a very affluent area. It was a fee-charging school, and it was just a wonderful place, and the learning there was flourishing. Then I went to a school about 4 kilometers away, which was a state school and served, for the most part, children of poor parents. And learning was also flourishing there. But the school principal asked me, he said, "Where else have you been today?" And I said, "I've been to school X." And I said, "There's a very different kind of ambience up in school X." And he said something to me that has always stuck in my mind. You know, he said, the experience of young people, whether they're rich or poor, can be very similar. And he said, as a school principal, what I've learned, that what knocks people for 6, which really wounds them and hurts them, is when their parents divorce. And that applies whether the children are pupils in very rich schools or very poor schools. So let's not kind of dichotomize what happens in schools that serve the well-to-do and schools that serve the poor. But Frank McCourt writes of the school choice made by working-class parents from Irish backgrounds in New York. They tell him that they don't want to send their children to Catholic schools, and most of them are of Catholic background, because Catholic schools are not known for vocational or technical training. And this is what we want for our children. In Catholic schools, the parents explained to Frank McCourt, it's all history and prayers. History and prayers are all right for the next world, but we want our children to be prepared for this world. This is why we want them to have a practical, vocationally oriented learning. But it's a mistake to assume that this does not contribute to the cultivation of individuality. Of course it does. Next, I want to make a point that is so obvious that I'm almost embarrassed to make it. But we can overestimate the role of the school in learning. All learning does not take place in the school or within institutions of formal education. We need to have a wide conception of the context in which the cultivation of individuality can take place. And many out-of-school forms of learning provide this. I know here in Ireland, we have people saying, oh, schools need to do this. Schools need to teach young people how to drive. Schools need to be more involved in the mental health of young people. Now, of course, I think it's good that they should be involved with the mental health of young people. But people have a vision that the school can teach everything, and that no form of learning occurs outside institutions of formal learning. It's not true. Education occurs in multiple contexts. And we enjoy many experiences that are educative in a more general sense. Yes, I agree, education usually refers to what has been designed in order to teach us something. And schooling refers to the normal environment within which this occurs. But experiences may well be educative in the sense that we learn from them. For example, visiting an art gallery, a place of worship, or a hospital. Mike Cooley, whom I referred to earlier, gives powerful voice to the possibility of learning within the community. He acquired a notion of the cascade use of technologies, that is, the multiple use of technologies, by observing how women in rural Ireland in the 1950s and 60s could adapt a wedding dress to serve as a confirmation dress, and then to serve as a first communion dress. He learned from this. He also learned much by observing the blacksmith and the stonecutter at work. Sadly, many young people are unlikely to experience the rich encounters of school learning enjoyed by Mike Cooley. Still, learning within a community can be significant. After all, it takes a village to raise a child. And one of the areas where I think there's a big difference between what happens in the English-speaking world and the non-English-speaking world, for continental Europe. In the English-speaking world, in Ireland too, which is largely English-speaking, much to my dismay, for instance, team games are largely organized within schools. But in other jurisdictions, in Italy and in France, they commonly take place outside of the school. So, and they all provide a form of learning, and it doesn't have to be located in schools. Now, I come to the final point, and you guys must be getting tired of listening to me now. And it concerns the huge difficulty, if not impossibility, of achieving significant improvement in the life chances of the less well-off. I know that's a controversial thing to say, but it's been my experience. The absence of cultural capital can frustrate the achievement of rich versions of individuality on the part of the children of the poor. It can, I'm not saying it always does, but it can. But young people who come from poor backgrounds are at a serious disadvantage compared to young people who come from affluent backgrounds, where learning is valued. And they're also at a disadvantage compared to young people who come from communities like that of Mike Cooley's, with rich and living trade traditions. I'm talking here particularly about people who young people who come from very kind of ghetto communities. The children of the well-off are equipped with what the Italian writer Elena Ferrante describes as a map of prestige. A map of prestige. That's a map which shows them how to navigate the world of social prestige. And this map of prestige, says Ferrante, she's a novelist, not an educational theorist, but it furnishes young people with magical weapons before the battle, before entering life. To adapt a metaphor from poetry, the children of the less well-off are not versed in what an Irish poet refers to as the secret scripture of the rich. Now, I adapt that expression from another context, but I think it's a wonderful expression that captures what the advantage that children from rich backgrounds have. They are conscious of and able to read the secret scripture of the rich. In any case, leaving kind of class distinction out of it, we live in servitude to the scarce resources of the world. That's an expression of Oakeshott's that always stuck in my mind. We live in servitude to the scarce resources of the world. And these include the number of prestige-bearing, ego-involving occupations available to people. There is only a limited number of high-status employment opportunities in society. No amount of social engineering can allow everyone to become a chief executive of a company, a surgeon, or medical specialist, or a university professor for that. So, to sum up, Oakeshott's theory of civil association is inadequate to support the extensive form of education that is one of the underlying postulates of his theory. There's in his work a disconnect between his political philosophy and his philosophy of education. However, I tried to show in this paper that we can exaggerate the need for state investment and state intervention in education. People are not as state dependent as some writers assume. And the place of state intervention in education is more complex than many people assume. So, obrigado.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very enlightening. I think we all benefited from hearing your analysis of the civil association, what it means, the role of Oakeshott's theory of education when thinking in his political philosophy context. We have apparently Professor Half has a question, so I'll let him speak.
Okay, Kevin, that was very, very interesting. Thank you very much. It's been a long time since I've read Oakeshott on civil association. I think it was in the 70s. But he always struck me as a kind of mix between a conservative and a liberal.
Yes.
He seemed to want both, have his cake and eat it, because he liked the idea, as you've said, of the traditions, the civil association formed by some kind of moral identity between people, etc. But at the same time, he was very keen on the market system for the distribution of resources, including educational resources, which is exactly the dichotomy and the problem that you've created. But I think first, I've got two questions. But first of all, I think I would like you to explain to most of the people here what liberal education is for Oakeshott, because people brought up on American English might misinterpret liberal education and think it's something very, very different from what Oakeshott meant it to be. They might think it was something very progressive, which naturally includes vocational training and all these things that you wanted to include at the end. Whereas in Oakeshott's use of the term, it doesn't include that. So I think that clarification might help for people who have been brought up on American English, who might have been thinking, well, wait a minute, doesn't liberal education include all of this anyway? That's the first thing. And then maybe I'll have another question later or another point to make later if there's nobody else that wants to enter the debate. Oh, sorry.
That's very helpful, Ralph. Thanks very much, and thanks for that clarification.
So how did Oakeshott think of liberal education? Okay, he included these questions of things that bind the community together. Obviously, he was looking here at the question of traditions, of sort of organic links between people that a tradition and the authority of tradition can bring, etc. But what else did he included art and aesthetics, which is very interesting as well, as you said, but what else did he include in this? From what I can understand, liberal education in Oakeshott means a classic English education. Or in other words, what was taught in schools in the day of Matthew Arnold. that
Yes.
sort of thing. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. And like, but I suppose he was never questioned about whether it could be extended into other spheres of human activity. But he did see it as concentrated on history, literature, and science. He includes science, which I suppose people might be a bit surprised at, but it was primarily focused on history and literature, and languages as well, in different languages. It was not an expansive form of education in the way that I'd like to conceive of education.
The curriculum of English public schools in the
Yes.
English sense.
Yes, well put.
Not the other sense. Can I ask another question if there's
Yes,
nobody
please.
else? It seems to me, from my reading of Oakeshott a long time ago, but and I really haven't reread it for your talk. I'm sorry, I should have reread something in preparation for today, but it wasn't possible. It seems to me that his account of history is quite Hegelian. He wants the idea that he wants to see some kind of progress in history from some kind of undifferentiated to two possibilities: a common good or an individuality, as a moral identity. And I wonder to what extent that's ignoring, first question is, I wonder to what extent that's ignoring history, real history. Is that how history develops, or is history something much more plural than that? And the second question is in relation to individuality, whether the sort of individuality and autonomy that he was looking for is possible. I mean, aren't we all, to a certain extent, inserted within educational practices, within a space that is both social, cultural, and ethical, and has norms that to a certain extent regulate that space? And so if we're inserted into an ethical, through education, into an ethical space, we can never be truly individual in the sense that he wanted, it seems to me. That seems to me to be an impossibility. It's almost an idea of autonomy as complete independence from the other, whereas autonomy for me involves a dependence on others as well, because a complete individuality is not possible in my view. I don't know how you think about that.
Yeah. I'd like to take, first of all, that very interesting question about his concept of history. And when he wrote about the evolution of different moral types, he was writing in very, very broad strokes. And in fact, I got a sense that like this is the way kind of Marx sometimes write about history, in broad strokes. But that's when he was writing about the evolution of moral ideal, and I think the broad strokes are much too lack nuance. But when he writes about history and the nature of history, it's very different. It's much more fine-grained, and it's much more nuanced, and it's very, very different indeed. So again, there's a tension there between the writing about the moral ideal and then how he conceives of history as a very, I suppose, a very nuanced, fine-grained activity that works with what did Jane Austen say about she worked in a quarter-inch of ivory. She works in very, very small, a very small sphere of human activity. That's the way he conceives of history, as being far more fine-grained and not broad stroke. And the other thing was about autonomy. That's true as well. And it possibly is the tension between his concept of autonomy and his lack of kind of a sufficient sense of the communal dimension of the way we can sometimes find autonomy. Our autonomy is expressed in our life through our life in community. And I think that's just an omission that, Ralph, if you want to take up your pen and your mouse and write about it, that's a really good point, that like autonomy and individuality have to be community based. They're not something in a sphere apart. So thank you for that.
I'll now leave other people to intervene. I've got lots of other questions, but I won't. I'll resist.
Kevin, I know I have a question that has been lingering in my mind for a while regarding Oakeshott. I know you talked about this in your book about the curriculum, about Oakeshott's notion of an elitist curriculum, right? And I keep thinking, like, what is the notion of individuality that Oakeshott wants people to have when you have like a group sort of dictating the curriculum or dictating what is the current trend in education or what needs to be known? How do we deal with that? How do you think we should approach that, thinking of Oakeshott, with this sort of power grab in education? Like, we know what is best, we're going to tell you, and this is what it is. So just to see if I'm making sense here, how do we navigate in this current world in which we receive this outside interference in school dictating what needs to be taught, and how to include those lower classes or less favorite classes into this notion of individuality by Oakeshott?
You see, that's again, I suppose, an omission in his work. He doesn't discuss whether the curriculum should be prescribed by local authorities, by the state, or states, or in federal organizations. That's not his concern, and I suppose it's perhaps a bit unfair to expect him to write about that. I think that if he were to give an opinion on it, he would say that the curriculum of liberal education should be largely left up to the discretion of the teachers and the schools. That's just my sense, but I'm not sure if that's true. And apparently in the United Kingdom, that's the way it used to be up until the 1980s. Well, there was a huge amount of discretion allowed. But I'm not really sure.
Can I come in on that point, Felipe? Because it seems to me that there needs to be some kind of social control of the resources necessary for the full kind of education that you were arguing for. Now, normally that social control is seen as via the state, and that leads usually sometimes to the complaint or the accusation that the state then becomes authoritarian, it then becomes even fascist, and a small group of people in the name of everybody then dominates the curriculum, and probably in this case continues with the liberal education curriculum in form of the other one. I'd like to ask you, rather than Oakeshott, if you agree that there has to be some social control of this, both the distribution and the resources and the practice in education. And if that doesn't mean that education has to be solely public, in the case, for example, in the case of Finland, where there is no private education, how can it be organized so that social control can be effective and can't be hijacked by some small elite?
Wow, that's a huge question. And I think my answer to that is as follows. I think that when curricula are being designed, the voices which should predominate are the voices of educators. And certainly I know in the case of Ireland, the voices of educators are very often silenced, and they have curricula visited upon them, and they don't have a choice in the matter. So I would say, let the teachers decide what the curriculum should contain. I can do no better than that, I suppose.
But that implies letting these teachers participate in the whole curriculum development process, which is what is not happening at the moment, as I understand
Exactly.
it, in the United Kingdom, nor in Brazil.
More is the pity.
Se vocês têm perguntas, podem mandar pelo chat ou até pelo YouTube aí, que a gente consiga repassar aqui. Então, por favor, vocês podem fazer perguntas.
I'll wait. Got one other question I'd like to ask Kevin, but I'll wait. Can I ask it if nobody else is?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, it's in relation to aesthetics. I was very interested in how you raised the aesthetic dimension and how you said that Oakeshott was very, very concerned about this, you know? And that reminded me of John Dewey and John Dewey's idea of art as experience, and the idea that in the beginning of that book, when he says that by aesthetics, he doesn't mean just art, appreciating art or producing art. He means a sensibility to the world that permeates all of our experience, whatever it is, including enterprise experience in enterprise associations, and should therefore be central to educational experience. He even defines educational experience as an experience with a strong aesthetic dimension. Has that got anything to do with what Oakeshott's saying, or is it completely different?
Oh, I think it's very different, Ralph. It's very different and very interesting, and it's very profound, really, what Dewey says. For Oakeshott, aesthetic experience is primarily an experience of delight, of pleasure, of satisfaction, of joy in music, in words, or in painting. That's what art is about. However, one of the kind of contradictions in his work is that when he's writing not about education or not about art, he says it's interesting to note that the different sensibilities that are likely to be acquired by English young people who are introduced to Shakespeare and study Shakespeare, and French young people whose kind of literary diet would be, in his day anyway, Molière, Racine, Corneille, the great French writers. And he says this must surely affect the sensibility of the young people, which is in contradiction with his view that when he's writing about aesthetics, that aesthetics and art are about delight and delight alone, and they don't have a direct connection to the way we live our lives.
Thank you. Now I will shut up.
Kevin, I have another question here, really quick. Once again, I keep going back to what I read from you. And I know it's been, I think, around 15 years since you wrote that book on Oakeshott. And my question is, do you still think that liberal learning has a place as we, progress? How do you view that in current trends in education? Do you think the way Oakeshott envisioned liberal learning, do you think that's accessible, that should be for everyone? How do you feel about that?
Well, that's a huge question, but I think that in a way, his concept of education and his conception of education has been an education of high culture should in principle be accessible to everyone. And I think that I'd still agree with that. I still find that plausible, but that we have to find ways of integrating that into the classroom and into the lives of young people. And let me give you an example. There was a novel, an autobiography that was studied for years and years in Irish schools. It's called Peg. That's the woman's name, Peg. It's written in Irish. And generations of Irish students found it very tedious because it was about the life and hardship of a woman growing up on an island off the west coast of Ireland. And anyway, I worked for several years in the early 80s as a teacher in a really tough school. And I don't want to spoil the story now by telling you this. I was traveling from here to England one time, and I met this young man who was a steward on the ship. And he said, "Oh, I'd love to come and have a chat with you about school and how things have gone since I've left." Now, the boy was a very challenged learner. He was a lovely lad, but he was not very literate, and he found difficulty writing, but he was a good lad. And I asked him, what was his most positive memory of school? And he said it was the study of Peg. Now, for people, I would say predominantly it's the more kind of the middle class people would say, "Oh, that was awful. That was tedious." I said, "What made it so good?" I said, "We had a great teacher. She brought it alive for us, and she made us act it out. And particularly, she made us dance." So I think that the curriculum of high culture can be made dance. I'll give you another example. Now, I know, gosh, I draw a lot on I like Seamus Heaney. That's one thing I have in common with him. I draw a lot on the great Irish writers. There was an Irish novelist called James Plunkett. He wrote a novel called Strumpet City that featured a lot about the 1916 Rising. It was published. It came out then as a play called The Risen People. And I can remember when I was a teacher, we helped the youngsters to put on this play, The Risen People. And I had said to them, "Lads, we're going to study the risen people," their heads would sink and they wouldn't be interested. But we made it into a play, and I could see some of these boys, and well, it was mostly boys, but not only boys. Some of them were very recalcitrant. They were negative. And but when they came to perform drama and utter these words and do these actions, they came alive. They became different lads. So that's another example of how high culture can be translated into something that the people connect with. And it's likewise even with teaching languages. I know say, "Oh, that's a kind of very middle class pursuit," but it needn't be. It can be kind of integrated into their lives, and it can be made fun. I remember, again, I used to be a French teacher, and I used to love changing the names of the children into their French equivalents. And kids with very Irish names used to resist it. "Oh, why don't you give us a sexy Irish name? Like Deirdre would be a good name, or Aisling. They're common Irish names. They can't really be translated. Can you not find a sexy name for us in French?" And I'm not saying I was great or anything like that, but at least it brought the kind of thing alive. And I said, this is like learning French isn't just something bookish or something that is disconnected from life. It is something that can be related to life. And in fact, I know this is very academic. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but people will be a bit shocked by it. One of the boys came in anyway. He said, "Oh, you like making French interesting. Can you tell me what this means?" And tell the class. And it was, "Voulez-vous coucher avec moi?" That, which I presume, I don't know if you guys in Portugal or in Brazil know that, but it means, "Will you have sex with me? Will you go to bed with me and have sex with me?" And I said, "Yes, I'll tell you what it means. It means, will you go to bed with me in the sense of having sex with me?" "Ha ha," he said, "ha ha." And I said, what I said, you must be careful about you saying that to a French woman. Oh, he says, why should I be careful about saying? Because she might think you meant it. And he came back very well to me. He said, touche, which means good.
Professor Ralph, you posed some questions there. Yes, in the chat, I was opening those right now. Would you like to you want me to repeat them to Kevin, or would you like to elaborate on them?
No, I just didn't want to open my mouth again, but I will. When you're talking about high culture and saying that you think there's nothing wrong with teaching high culture to all classes and all groups, I wonder how that fits with multiculturalism, which is a big thing nowadays in education, including citizenship education, which I'm sure which obviously you know about. And I wonder whether you can have high culture, teach high culture, and have multicultural education at the same time with the same group. I'm not saying you can't do it with different groups, but with the same group. That's one question. And just an observation, what you've been saying about embodiment, which I think is very interesting, and movement and dance and theatre is very consistent with new approaches to learning that work from the idea of embodied cognition and enactive cognition, etc., which I think are very interesting. They're beginning to emerge now. But that's more a comment. The question is more about the question of multiculturalism and teaching high culture.
But one of the things I think many teachers do in multicultural environments is, as far as possible, introduce young people to the cultural artifacts of people who come, well, in our case, it would be Western culture, who come from outside Western culture. And I think that that's perfectly consistent. Like teaching the poetry of Rumi or is perfectly consistent with multiculturalism. And I don't see there's a necessary conflict between teaching kind of rich and resonant literature and multiculturalism. And another aspect of multiculturalism that I think has to be confronted as well is the hegemony of the West and the colonialism of the West. Like my native language is not English, but unfortunately it's my mother tongue. Why? Because that's a result of colonialism, and colonialism has imposed itself in many countries throughout the world. And I think that's when we teach history, we have to be sensitive to this kind of multicultural context. That like the interventions of the West in countries in non-Western countries were not always benign. Actually, one of the writers who has commented on the Brazilian experiences, the French, great French writer Voltaire in Candide, and he shows that he illustrates that the intervention of the West was the Jesuits in Paraguay. I forget who it was in Brazil, and I forget who it was in Argentina. That their interventions in the culture were predatory and inimical to the welfare of the people in whose countries they came.
Just something that came to my mind as you're talking about high culture and other the teachings that Oakeshott he mentions about teaching the classics, right? Or talking to the classic voices of mankind, right?
Yeah, classic voices. Well,
I don't know if you have an answer for that, but I wonder if you found that in his understanding, how would the idea of maybe changing that to a younger generation, how would that fit into teaching the classes for Oakeshott? For instance, instead of using Romeo and Juliet itself, you use maybe the movie Romeo and Juliet to introduce the topic to a younger generation. Would that feed? That's just one example, of course, but would that feed into teaching the classics, or would Oakeshott understand that as some sort of corruption of the classics?
Oh, I don't think so. I think that would be just a very appropriate making accessible to young people some of the great classics. Although one of the ironies about Romeo and Juliet that is that they were only 14 and 16. They were underage lovers, and particularly for Romeo, he'd be prosecuted if he engaged in the relationship with Juliet. I remember as well. Again, it's funny that with all the philosophy I've read and theories I've read, I go back to my own experience quite a bit. And one day I had to take a group of tough boys and girls, but the boys were particularly tough, and to Roman Polanski's version of Macbeth. And they complained. They said, "Oh, we don't want to go to this. This is hopeless. This is anyway." It was. I don't know if anybody knows Roman Polanski's version. It had the English actress Francesca Annis in it. Anyway, it was really, really good. It was gripping and compelling. And there wasn't a word out of them from beginning to end. Anyway, when they went back to their peers in school the next day, what did that teacher bring you to that darn movie for? They said, it was really good. It was full of sex and violence. So that's Roman Polanski's Macbeth. So he certainly made it that culture available to my poor kids.
I believe there's another question in the chat. Professor Rolf, would you elaborate on that for Kevin, please?
Yeah, when you are defending high culture in multiculturalism, it seemed to me that you're defending a kind of multiculturalism where there's a culturation of the outside groups into a culture. And I wonder if that isn't colonial. I'm sorry, I'm being very provocative now. Yes. I wonder if that isn't colonial, and we shouldn't be promoting interculturality, which for me has a different meaning. It means that all cultures are treated equally and everybody has to learn everybody else's culture. What do you think about that? Or do you think that's just a waste of time?
I don't think it's a waste of time, but I don't think we have to be careful about saying cultures have to be treated equally. I understand what you mean about assimilation, and that's the kind of French project, and it's the one that I know many people deplore. Like if you come to France, you become French. That is your privilege to become French. They're very assimilationist, but we have to be careful about being uncritical in our attitudes towards other cultures. Like, for instance, take the French situation. The French politicians, I think, quite rightly draw attention to some of the oppressive practices of Islam in the way they treat women. And I think we have to be sensitive but careful, and certainly not kind of assume that what other cultures do is correct and acceptable. It's not correct.
Vamos ver se há outras perguntas no chat. Alguém? O Professor Rolf says in the chat, I agree that we shouldn't praise difference, just different. Oh, you have access to the chat. Thank you. Vamos ver se tem outras perguntas no chat, no YouTube. No. All right. So I'm going to be mindful of your request, Kevin. So I'm going to close end the session, right? Então, pessoal, como não há mais questões aqui, né, a serem encaminhadas, eu queria agradecer a todos aí que acompanharam a gente pelo Google Meet, pelos canais do... Oh, sorry. Sorry.
1 minute, just a minute, okay? Não é uma questão, not a question. Eu gostaria de, neste final de de período de conferências, de palestras, eu gostaria de fazer uma apresentação rápida, é mesmo 1 minuto. Please. Okay. Okay, wait 1 minute, please. Okay. Como eu faço para ler? Ok. Primeiro de tudo, ok. Vou tentar aqui. Alan Gorumahagut.
Oh, obrigado. Obrigado.
I think this is thank you in Irish.
It is.
Okay, thank you. Gorumaragut.
Okay. Super.
Thank you.
Super. Muito bem.
Okay. Only a presentation about people from our event, okay? Primeiro, professora Carlota, diretora da unidade, diretora da faculdade, quem agradecemos. A professora Cristiane Gottschalk, a quem também agradecemos. Notem, eu falo apenas da comissão organizadora, obviamente, agradecemos muito a Sophie, a diretoria da Sociedade Brasileira de Estudos Clássicos, na figura aqui do professor Ralph, thank you very much. Muito obrigado, professor. Obrigado ao professor Samuel, ao professor Luiz Gomes, à professora Lina do Vale, a todos que nos ajudaram. Apenas gostaria de pontuar alguns nomes da comissão organizadora. Então, a professora Cristiane Gottschalk, minha colega na unidade, a quem agradecemos. Agradecemos a professora Juliana Oliva, também da FEUSP. Professor Rogério de Almeida. O Edson me avisa que eu falei de novo Sociedade Brasileira de Estudos Clássicos. Desculpem, é o meu hábito. Brazilian Society of Classical Studies, excuse me, is not. Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia da Educação. Eu faço confusão entre as duas porque participo das duas, perdão. Professor Rogério de Almeida, colega também da FEUSP, com quem conversaremos hoje à noite no lançamento dos livros, que teremos à noite. E aqui, os alunos que nos ajudaram, os estudantes que nos ajudaram, o Armando, que é mestrando na FEUSP, me orientando, a Bárbara, que é mestranda também, minha orientanda, Bárbara também, Palharina, Elvin Souza, pós-doutoranda pela FEUSP, que nos ajuda, o Éder, precisei roubar uma foto do Éder na apresentação dele, porque ele não tem a foto em lugar nenhum, doutorando, orientando a professora Cristiane. O Danilo, recém-mestre pela FEUSP, meu orientando, ex-orientando agora, mestre. O Felipe, mestre pela FEUSP, né? Meu orientando também. A Maria Camargo Borim, consegui a foto dela apenas no sistema da USP, então, por isso essa foto formal, 3x4, muito obrigado. Do Rafael também, eu só consegui a foto do WhatsApp dele, então ele está com essa foto divertida aí, this funny face in this slide. A Renata foi me orientanda na FEUSP, hoje é doutoranda lá no Canadá, na Simon Fraser University, só que com S, não com Z. Okay. O Vitor Hugo, também mestrando, me orientando. O André Mário, que fez as traduções para o português da fala do professor Williams, da fala do professor Pista, a quem agradecemos muitíssimo pelo grande trabalho, hercúleo trabalho. Muito obrigado, André Mário, mestrando da FEUSP, orientando a professora Cristiane. O Bruno Drummond, que é o meu orientador de doutorado e que carregou o piano, fez o trabalho pesado também na organização. Ele aí está lá em Atenas, olha só na foto. Então, muito obrigado, Bruno. O Edson Afonso, também doutorando, eu coloquei 2 fotos, uma do Edson, meio vous voulez coucher avec moi, desse lado aqui, né, sexy, né? E o Edson também no Taj Mahal, na Índia. A quem agradeço muito, porque ele fez com que tudo isso acontecesse também. E, por último, para darmos um destaque, porque ela merece, a nossa querida Cláudia Kurokawa, que é quem fez com que tudo isso pudesse acontecer. Ela é muito reservada, não gosta de aparecer, mas foi ela quem fez tudo isso aqui acontecer. As transmissões, tudo. Então, muito, muito obrigado, Cláudia. Então, muito obrigado, muitas graças, thank you, Guru Mahagut. Ok? Era isso que eu queria dizer. Muitíssimo obrigado. Thank you, professor William. Thank you, professor Ralph. É uma alegria muito grande podermos chegar no final digamos, da parte dedicada às palestras com essa apresentação tão significativa. Muito obrigado, do fundo do coração. À noite teremos o lançamento dos livros. Convidamos a todos, por favor, a prestigiar os professores e comentarem também os livros que vão ser apresentados. Era isso, Felipe, com você, fique à vontade para encerrar.
Claro, mais uma vez, eu queria agradecer aí todo mundo que está, né, no canal do YouTube da Sofia, do Pai Delma, pessoal do Google Meet. Então, a gente encerra aqui, né, essa sessão do 4º Congresso da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia. Eu vou abrir para o Bruno falar alguma coisa, mas lembrá-los, comunicações iniciam 4h30, né? E a gente vai ter sessões às 7h, 19h30, né? Com lançamento de vários livros, conversa dos autores e tudo mais. Só lembrando vocês aí.
So perhaps I could thank Professor Williams, who's leaving now. Thank you very much. Sorry that some of it was in Portuguese, but I know that you've just said that you like languages, so it's a bit of practice for you.
Exactly.
Until we meet again, thank you very, very much.
Okay.
On behalf of the Sociedade, we appreciate it very much.
Muito obrigado a todos.
Thank you, Kevin.
Bye. Boa noite.
O Bruno não vai falar?
Boa noite.
Desculpa, Marcos, desculpa, Felipe, excuse me, Professor Williams, Professor Bannon, só queria destacar aqui a mensagem que a professora Cristiane enviou no chat, como um agradecimento a você também, Marcos, pelos esforços na realização desse evento aqui.
All right. Thank you once
Muito
again.
obrigado, muito obrigado. Thank you. Muito obrigado.
Once again, thank you, Kevin, for being here.
You're welcome.
Obrigado a todos.
De nada.
Tchau.
Até
Obrigado.
De nada. Boa noite.
Boa noite.